This is Life Worlds, the place where we explore life through other eyes and minds. Let's flip the script and discover how to orient your world around nature. I'm Alexa Permanish. Come join me as we get down and forage for fungi, stalk coyotes, draft laws for rivers, hum with beehives, sing bird language, and help beavers to dam again. Let these stories spark your reconnection to nature's multiverse. Learn how to bring ecosystems back to life, become an agent for other intelligences, and begin to see how you too are the sum of all life worlds. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Life Worlds. Today, we're talking about ecocide and asking whether the destruction of nature and the biosphere could become considered as a crime akin to that of genocide, and how the laws that govern our human societies and economies fundamentally alter who we are. Now, you may have heard on this podcast before, if you tuned into our episodes on the rights of nature, how transformative law can be and how it shapes a civilization's norms and behaviors. Throughout all of this work, I've come to realize that laws are not just about stacks of dusty papers that late-night caffeinated lawyers have to plow through to find that one clause or precedent that will make them a winning case. And shout out to my friends, you know who you are. And neither are laws just bothersome frameworks that get in the way of a little bit of rule-breaking and fun. No, I have actually found that law and jurisprudence really illuminate who any society is at a point in time and show us what it is that we value and care about. They construct an important part of the narrative of our collective identity and story, and often are almost invisible and subconscious in our day-to-day lives. It was Ruth Ginsburg, who was the second woman ever appointed to the US Supreme Court, and a champion of women's rights and LGBT rights and many, many other marginalized groups, who said that the power of the law lies in its ability to transform societal norms, giving a community a higher vision of itself. And in a similar vein, Nelson Mandela said that the true test of a society's progress is found in its laws, for they not only constrain, but also liberate us to become who we truly are. And so today, we'll be discussing the movement around international ecocide law, which has seen a massive surge in popularity and could very well transform how we hold actors accountable globally for harmful actions on nature. For etymology geeks like myself, eco, from ecocide, derives from the Greek word oikos, which means house or home, and side comes from the Latin sedere, meaning to strike down, to demolish, to kill. So ecocide literally translates as killing our home. Now, its legal definition took quite a lot of time, and it was finally agreed upon in June 2021 after long nights of discussions by a global panel of experts. And let me read it out to you, because by definition, when we speak of ecocide today, we are speaking to unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there's a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. Committed with the knowledge, I think here is very important to hone in on. Now, a little bit of history, because context is useful. From the 1970s onwards, many academics and scholars argued for the criminalization of ecocide and have been debating the elements required for it to pass. This was chiefly sparked after the US devastated the environment in Vietnam through the use of Agent Orange, and the Prime Minister of Sweden called the war an ecocide. And the movement, since then, has ticked along quietly and steadily until the late barrister Polly Higgins picked up the flame and ignited this movement. And since the late 2010s, ecocide law has been gaining great momentum. And now many corporations and countries like Brazil, Spain, and England are backing the movement. The EU has recently, that's the European Union, has recently passed a law that criminalizes actions that are comparable to ecocide. And even the Vatican is in it. Pope Francis called for the need to incorporate ecocide as a fifth category of crimes against peace. And so what is it that the Stop Ecocide movement is specifically advocating for? They want to take this to the International Criminal Court in The Hague, where the most serious crimes of concern to the whole international community get addressed. The statute of the ICC can be amended to add a fifth crime, ecocide, which would elevate ecocide to the same level as genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the crime of aggression. The implications of this law being ratified means that those individuals who are the most responsible for decisions that risk leading to large-scale destruction can be brought to justice, either in their home countries or as a court of last resort in The Hague. And so establishing this as an international crime, we hope, would be a deterrent for severe environmental destruction and possibly help level the playing field for businesses globally, a sort of chilling factor, if you will. Our guest today, who will bring us deeper into this movement, is Pella Thiel, a maverick ecologist, farmer, and author who has co-founded Swedish hubs of international networks like Transition Sweden and Ecocide Sweden, and she is an associate of the Center for Environment and Development Studies at Uppsala University. Pella was awarded the Swedish Martin Luther King Award in 2023 for her work and the Environmental Hero of the Year Award in 2019. With Pella, we discuss why ecocide law is different and a game changer when compared to other environmental laws, how ecocide can help create a new moral baseline affecting global values and mindsets, where the tensions and synergies may lie between the rights of nature and ecocide law. We talk about the notion of positive tipping points and a radical creative idea about how an embassy of the Baltic Sea might play out as a practice center for ecological community building. Now, for me, this is super exciting stuff, even if it's, legal, which is sometimes associated with things that are dry. And as a side note, with my activities at Naya Trust, we have decided to support Stop Ecocide in their valiant work. We need alternatives ASAP to slow the pace of destruction of the Earth's key ecosystems. And it was Milton Friedman who once said that when a crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around and can be picked up. This, I believe, is our basic function, to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable." End quote. I think ecocide is one of those policies, that it is inevitable, and I'm excited for this episode to bring us further into its world. Welcome to Life Worlds.
Thank you so much, and welcome to Sweden at some other time.
It's such a joy to have you here. We've been chatting for years, actually, initially about the rights of nature, and you've been sharing so much of your work with me about your advocacy for more than human life. And today we'll be focusing on some of those legal interventions, but I know that you work on this across multiple spheres, both with, ecotherapy, eco-psychology, you are running a beautiful farm. I mean, you're in the midst of it and kind of walking across different paradigms and approaches, which is a reason why I'm also really, really excited to speak with you about this. The premise of today will be to talk about ecocide, but that'll weave into some of the other incredible activities you're up to as well. But just for people who are listening, and I queued it up a little bit in the introduction to this episode, but for you, why is ecocide different to other types of law? Why is it such a game changer? And why is it that you personally are putting so much of your time and effort into supporting it as a global movement?
Yeah. So first, what is it? Ecocide. I mean, the name is revealing. It means literally killing your home, the oikos, the home. And our home is the planet Earth. And so it means mass damage and destruction of nature. And when we are talking about it, we're talking about it as an international crime to sit with the other international crime in the International Criminal Court in The Hague. And those crimes are today 4. It's war crimes, crimes of aggression, crimes against humanity, and genocide, which makes the parallel to ecocide very clear. And sadly today, these crimes and that institution is sort of surfacing in the agenda of society because of events in Israel and Palestine and the Ukraine. And what we are working for is for Ecocide to sit there. So with the most serious crimes, that when they are committed, the whole world has to pay attention. The international community has to pay attention. That's how these crimes came about in the first place after the Second World War, when it became clear that there was such atrocities that had happened, and that we cannot sit and watch that happen, even if there is someone who claims to have all the power in his own country. Um, so to have Ecocide there is to say that what's happening today in nature on a global scale is not acceptable. Like, we have to do something against that, and people who have the power to make such things happen, they have to also have a responsibility for their actions. And to me, that's so powerful because of two things. One is that it's such a systemic approach to where we are, because we have a system that's based on, and you have been covering this beautifully in your podcast so far, but based on the separation between humans and nature, like that idea that we have in Western culture, that makes us think that dominating and controlling nature is actually what we should do. Like, that's what we are striving for. That is almost our duty. And today, when we are working from that idea, and we have this immense source of energy from the carbon pulse, from the fossil fuels, that makes us very destructive. So in a system that is doing this, and with all of the might of the energy and also the money, like, we are still investing in ecocidal activities collectively. Our pension funds are doing ecocide as we speak, and we think that's sort of good. So the actors in this system, they're just working from that logic, and they couldn't do anything else, basically. So to say that, well, we now understand that we can't continue with that. What was previously okay, what was previously legal, is no longer. So the worst cases of destruction of nature is now a crime at the highest level, at an international level, with an individual responsibility. So if you're involved with that, there is a risk that you could end up in The Hague. It's a very tangible personal consequence.
Just to clarify, what I'm hearing is both making it a crime at the highest level is different to what existing environmental laws are doing. And then secondly, this aspect of individual responsibility is also different to how existing environmental laws are operating. Is that correct?
Yeah, so both of those aspects have to do with ecocide being criminal law. So not civil law. A lot of the environmental legislation is civil law, but this is criminal law, meaning that there is a personal responsibility, and it's criminal law on an international level. And we don't have so much of that. So we have an economy that is operating on a global scale. It's a transnational economy. The biggest actors, the most powerful actors, they are operating on a transnational basis, but we don't have the corresponding governance institutions. We don't have a corresponding governance system. So there's basically that they're operating with impunity. There's nothing to hold them responsible. And this is what ecocide as a crime would do. And obviously, like, people working for this, we love nature and we love people. So it's not that we want people to end up in court. It's basically a crime of prevention. I mean, it's a preventative law. Nobody wants anyone to end up there, but just to say that this is the sanction, this is what could happen, that shifts the thinking. It shifts the risk assessment that these actors have to do all over the board. So, it's not like there's one CEO, because this is often a corporate crime, doing these things, but there has to be a whole system allowing that to happen. There has to be a financial actors financing these projects. There has to be insurance actors insuring those projects. And if it becomes a potential crime, then it just wouldn't be a discussion. You wouldn't go there.
So it becomes a deterrent.
Exactly. It becomes a deterrent. So today, if you ask a CEO of a bank, how come you are still financing new fossil fuel extraction in the Barents Sea when we know about climate change? Don't you know about climate change? And they would just say, well, yeah, of course, but it's profitable and it's legal. So I have to do that. Like, it's in my job description.
So maybe you could take us through a hypothetical example, right? On this aspect of like corporate behaviors and practices. So you mentioned, like funding ecocidal activities of extraction, let's say massive deforestation, mining fossil fuels. Obviously, we will always need some mining, but there's some mining that is absolutely not necessary and deeply environmentally destructive. Could you bring us through a case that you could imagine being brought forth? Like, bring us into the imagination. So there's this company that's doing this activity, and this is how the law is brought forth, and these are some of the. But it would be interesting to bring us through a hypothetical, actually, if you may.
Yeah, I have this picture in my mind where a CEO of an energy company, or of a bank, we can make it into a bank, and they have this project that they want to finance, and it involves opening new coal mines in Australia, for example, which is where some of our Swedish pension funds are going. And he's presenting this project, and he's also saying that, well, my granddaughter is now every Friday sitting outside of the city hall saying that climate change is threatening her future. And, we all know that she's right. And we know this. And the oil companies, they have known this for decades. So, I really think we can't we can't do this. We can't finance these kinds of projects. And then the chairman of the board would just say, okay, that's nice, but we are here to earn money for our shareholders. That's our duty. So if you don't want to do that, the door is over there. We will have to have a new CEO. And they would all be acting according to protocol. Like, this is how our system is working today. It's not that they're bad people. They're just following what the system wants them to do. Whereas if ecocide was a crime in the International Criminal Court, or just today when it's becoming actually discussed seriously, this CEO would maybe talk about his granddaughter, who is saying that, well, if you push this through, I will never speak to you again, because you are threatening my future, and you know it. I can't allow that. Maybe he would tell that personal story, but he would also say that, there is now serious discussion of these kinds of projects being potentially international crimes with a personal liability. And that means that I, as a CEO, and maybe you too, as a chairman of the board, could end up in The Hague. I don't think anyone is interested in that. Like, we are definitely personally not interested in that. Our customers are not interested in that. Our shareholders are definitely not interested in that. So, sorry, we can't go in that direction. We have to look at something else. And to me, that's so hopeful, because it's like, we know so much better, but we think it's too time consuming, or it's too expensive, or uh, too small scale, possibly, to do things in a regenerative way, in a way that's good for people and the earth. So we don't do it, but we could. And ecocide as a crime would be a powerful lever to steer a whole system in that direction, in a very, like a very actually elegant way.
I love that example, Pella. You really made it come alive. It's like a Jedi move inside of the current system. And I know that we share some friends like with Nate and Daniel, and they speak about different timelines, or you've got three horizons, right? And you have a sort of triage, transition, transformation timeline. And we actually really need things that operate within laws as they currently stand while we build some kind of world government. And we'll talk about rights of nature in a little bit, because I think the differences in intersectionality is something that's definitely worth getting into. But briefly, for me, I see rights of nature as more of the next paradigm, and ecocide as maybe still quite anthropocentric, however, um, hugely practical and efficient. And I think that we need every single tool in our toolbox currently, especially to enable actors who might want to quote unquote do the right thing, but they don't have any um, let's say corporate leeway in terms of their fiduciary duty to choose otherwise. So maybe a pension fund has a fiduciary duty to generate a certain type of return, and so yeah, I think that's quite interesting. I'm curious also, in a way that this is setting a new moral baseline, right? It's like a new series of ethics and values. How do you see ecocide intersecting with genocide and intersecting with human rights? As you said, this is about humans and nature. Um, how how does ecocide overlap with existing sort of human rights frameworks, and how would it complement them?
So there is a growing understanding of the importance, I mean, the obvious, the totally obvious importance of healthy ecosystems for healthy humans and for human rights. So one of the biggest threats to human rights is destruction of ecosystems and climate change. And we have only seen the beginning of that. So if we don't manage to protect the living systems of this planet, there is no way we can protect human rights. And it's directly, I mean, destruction of ecosystems and climate change are directly leading to conflict and to war, and that's where we have the most acute threats to human rights. And to me, these connections are so obvious, uh, and I think, as you say, this Jedi move to make ecocide a crime at the highest level is just so obvious a thing to do. It's quite simple, it's not expensive, and it would make a huge change. So for me, I have been working with this for over 10 years, like as a volunteer, as an activist. And I think it's so astonishing. Like, why do I have to do that? This the most obvious thing. Why isn't there like governments and large NGOs working for this? But it's actually not. Uh, until just recent years, when it's becoming discussion at governmental level, very, very promising. And so the other thing about why to put so much time of my life into just ecocide law is because not just the practical effects that we mentioned, with like moving attention, moving money, moving our collective behavior, is also the, as you say, the moral implications, to have nature inside of the framework that is there to protect human rights, like the last resort to protect humans from the worst atrocities, is that connection that we are then making as a culture, I believe, on a cultural level, uh, as a collective understanding that we are a part of nature. So to say that you can't do anything to nature unless it may become a criminal activity, that shifts how we collectively view what we, from a cultural viewpoint now, mainly see as a resource and talk about as a
Mm-hmm.
resource. But if you can commit a crime against nature, then it's not just a resource. Uh, and the elegant thing about ecocide law being that bridge between systems, as you spoke about, is that you can view it from both an anthropocentric, a purely anthropocentric viewpoint, just making the connection that humans need nature, we have to protect nature for humans. But you can also view it from a rights of nature, from a life centric viewpoint, saying that, well, if we believe that nature is sacred and has the right to life, just as humans have, uh, then obviously you have to have law to protect that right. Just like, my life is sacred. So there is a crime called murder, where society takes the responsibility to protect my life. If I was killed, it wouldn't be the responsibility of my husband, for example, to go to court and say, well, my wife got killed. We have to bring a case here. But that's the case today for nature.
Though that's a super compelling example. You sent me over a book that you've co-authored before this episode, and you use the language of positive tipping points, which I think is hugely important. I think we hear often today, especially those of us working in this sort of climate and nature and biodiversity space, about tipping points ecologically, where the Earth's operating system, sort of like the Jenga tower, and you push out all the blocks until the very last block goes, and then the system tips into a new state. And often this is used quite negatively. The Amazon, the AMOC currents, the melting of the ice sheets. Positive tipping points, therefore, being especially kind of internal social movements that actually lead to a cascade of positive changes and ripples across society that we can predict. You've written that things like the rights of nature and ecocides are examples of these potential positive tipping points. And you've been active right across all these different movements. We also covered rights of nature in a previous episode in the first season, so people can go back and listen to that episode as well for background. Where do you see the tensions and the synergies, which you were just alluding to a little bit, between these different legal movements in terms of how they're a tipping point?
Uh, I there is I meet tensions around them sometimes, and it makes me confused because I don't see it as tensions. I see ecocide law as the bridge, a stepping stone. It's a goal, but it's not the goal. Just as rights of nature for me isn't the goal. I think that's just also an obvious idea. Like, if we understand that we are alive in this amazing universe with all of the other beings, to say that they also have the right to life is kind of obvious. So that's also, I mean, in my mind, that's also a stepping stone, and in different contexts, those stepping stone work differently, and they work more or less well. So I moderated a seminar actually just a couple of weeks ago with some CEOs and sustainability managers of quite large corporations who have become officially active behind ecocide law. And we were discussing how that was for them. Like, was it difficult? Do they had to convince people, because it has been seen as quite radical? And they were like, no, it's obvious. We want to be good actors in business, and we don't want to be in competition with bad actors. So of course we want good rules. No, we didn't have any. There was no obstacles at all. So in a corporate setting, ecocide law works very well, whereas rights of nature is working in other settings. but they speak the same language to me.
And rights of nature would be more on a sort of national level, would you say, or where would it be more appropriate?
Um, rights. So ecocide law is a very specific piece of this puzzle. It's even been defined by the organization I work within, which is Stop Ecocide International, has proposed through gathering an independent panel of legal expertise. They have defined it, and I will read the definition
Mm-hmm.
so that everyone knows how it could potentially be defined in the Rome Statute of the International Court. So, for the purpose of this statute, the Rome Statute, ecocide means unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. So this is international legal language. It's coming from international law. So in that space, ecocide law works, very well. It's that language, but it's very specific. It's in a it's one crime in one institution, whereas rights of nature is that big paradigm shift in how we collectively view nature and our relationship to it and our role as humans in this world. And uh, that can be translated into law. So those rights can be upheld at legal level, and it could be, at local level. And there are cases at local level, at national level, and at international level. So I was part of a group lobbying actually for rights of nature being a part in the Convention of Biodiversity, which had a new agreement, like a Paris Agreement for nature, the Kunming-Montreal Agreement being adopted a couple of years ago. And that's the first time actually when rights of nature got into international policy. So on all scales, uh, and it could, those rights, they can be legal rights, but they can also be moral rights. So rights of nature is a legal thing, but it's also a cultural thing in how we act towards nature. And I don't think actually, and this is the beauty of rights of nature, that it's not possible to do one thing without the other. You can't have those laws. Like you can't shift into rights of nature laws without there being a cultural backing. And the laws are also supporting a cultural understanding of respect towards the living world.
What do you think has to go right for ecocide to be successful? I mean, is it, citizens who are listening, they go to their local Stop Ecocide chapter and they lobby for it, and then let's say it does get ratified by the ICC, then obviously people have to make claims, right, and bring those claims to their national government. So we need lawyers who know, like what's the sort of what's the success story? You spoke about that example of the CO, but this is a bit of a different question. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
let's say ecocide has been recognized. How can people then use that? Because I wouldn't know where to bring a genocide claim, for example. Like I've just never looked into doing that myself. So how can everyday people engage with this? Or we have a few lawyers that listen to this podcast. It's like, how can lawyers back this? Are there technologies that would be useful, like people who are developing technologies? Would that be a part of it too? Like, what does the ecocide movement look like?
I mean, let me first just say something about where we are, because when I met with the British lawyer who is the main person who has brought this idea to the forefront, Polly Higgins. I met with her 12 years ago. And at that time, it was such a fringe, radical idea. Like very few people thought that this would become reality. It was like for some people a joke, for other people a utopian dream. And this has changed so fast, you know. So I just started to talk about it and to write about it because I thought, this, if we don't have this, then, you know, we're screwed. So it's worth a go, even if it's a utopian dream. And now, since that definition was presented in, that's more or less exactly 3 years ago, the international discussion has just exploded. So we now have, I'm losing track, it's about 25 states that has either discussions on parliamentary or governmental level on ecocide. And there is a discussion within the International Criminal Court itself. And recently in spring, the European Union got a new environmental crime directive where they have ecocide level crimes, as they call it. So it's now actually being implemented in EU member states. So this is becoming, you know, just the next step. But I love your question, because as with all environmental law, we have a lot of good laws. They are not being implemented. So we always have to have that backing of people who care, lawyers who care, who can bring these cases, who can, you know, collude all the information that's needed to bring such a case. And so when, it's now not if, even from the International Criminal Court itself, we are hearing that this is not, this will happen. It's just a question of when. And from what I'm hearing, it could actually be tabled even this year. And then there will be obviously a diplomatic process to make a strong support and agreement for it. And in that work, people and lawyers who are active, who keep informing their politicians and their civil servants and keep them, that's basically what we have been doing, just, you know, waving this flag saying that this is a possibility, we could do this, these people are talking about it, you know, get active. And that's really important, that people are just knowing that it's a possibility and keep talking about it.
If I'm a lawyer, I'm a scientist, I'm someone, you know, living in a country, as we all are, and I witness some environmental crime, I could then, you know, gather the evidence from the scientists and the people on the ground. I could then go to the local, you know, the local lawyers, and then we would present a case to our municipality or government and say, there is this, you know, global thing called ecocide. You might not have heard of it, but we've now gathered this evidence and we have a strong case. We know the individuals behind it. And then we would go to our politicians and ask them on a national level to go to the International Criminal Court. That's sort of how, like, I could get engaged with it, let's say.
I love your questions because they help me become a bit more clear. Um, so, two things. One is that the ICC is a court of last resort. So it's there to say that this is a crime that's working on international level, which, as I say, is important because the actors are on a transnational level. And just let me clarify that a bit, because in our countries, we have a lot of, there are corporations which tend to outsource their dirty work to other, often poorer countries with less environmental regulations, which then threatens people and nature overseas. And that would be very difficult to do if ecocide was an international crime. But the International Criminal Court is a court of last resort. So they only have cases where the country, the state party of the ICC, is unable or unwilling to prosecute. So the first thing that's happened is that when ecocide becomes an international crime, that the state parties ratify that crime, and then the court cases will primarily be national. And for anyone who knows anything about the ICC, you know that just because a crime enters that space doesn't mean that the countries ratify it themselves. So this is just the beginning of a long process where we need, we need so many voices to yeah, to have it there, and to just keep talking about the importance of it, to educate each other about that. And to do that, what we have been doing in Stop Ecocide International is to have to get a really broad support from many different directions of society. So we have networks for youth, for indigenous peoples, for faith, for business, for scientists, for lawyers. So just go into that website and see, how can I become active here from my perspective and from my area of expertise.
This is what I love about it, Pella. It is movement building, and I think that when we look at the history of humankind, no great shifts happened without that upsurge, right? Of popular sentiment. And so I think for me, Ecocide is exciting because it's a very tangible way for all of those kinds of people you just described to belong to something that really has teeth. And I think that's very cool. Um, One of the things I also really appreciate about you is your creativity. Um, and you've been developing an idea about the Baltic Sea. This falls a little bit more into the rights of nature space, but I think it should be part of our conversation. And you've suggested this idea of a sort of embassy of the Baltic Sea. And just for context, um, I've heard from quite a few people now that the Baltic Sea is basically like dead, or at least a dying sea, and it's suffering from just pollution and overfishing, and it must be incredibly tragic. It's, many nations share its shores, and in a way, it is a very explicit tragedy of the commons, right? Where like it's the commons, no one really quote unquote owns it or has collective responsibility. And in the paper that you sent me, you spoke about like the herring fishery, the herring fish. So, what's this idea about an embassy of a Baltic Sea? I remember reading a few years ago about the embassy of the North Sea, that I think is a concept that's been around for a little bit longer. But yeah, tell us about that and what's brewing over there.
Yeah. So definitely, this is from the rights of nature perspective, and I've been pondering, like, how do we work with rights of nature in a legal setting like Sweden? A lot of the cases so far are from the south, from Latin America. Latin America, like Bolivia and Ecuador, are really leaders in this space, with Ecuador having it into its constitution already in 2008, and they have a lot of very interesting court cases from there. And then there is local cases from the US, but the first European case came in 2022 from Spain, regarding a saltwater lagoon, Mar Menor. And I think rights of nature is sort of more foreign for our institutions, so it felt like a long, long way to get it acknowledged. Though we have actually developed a proposal to have it in the Swedish constitution, and that became a parliamentary motion, but it was voted down, obviously. So to me, I've been thinking about ways to work with rights of nature without trying to push it into law, because that seemed futile. And if we collectively recognize the rights of nature, then we would have to have representation, obviously, because we can't have ecosystems in human institutions. There has to be humans voicing the needs of nature. And it's actually, to me, rights of nature is more about, it's sometimes ridiculed, even from the beginning. There was this the first case in the US where a judge even wrote a poem about having brooks babble in the courts. So it's easy to mock in that sense. But it's not about, nature isn't interested in rights at all. This is just a concept for us to govern ourselves in relationship to the living systems, not perceiving that we govern living systems, because we don't. Like, we can have that idea, but it's a flawed idea. So the embassy is a way to both potentially practically do that, to represent nature in a transnational setting. And how do we work with representation in a transnational setting? Well, we have embassies. And I like it also because it's a very sticky idea. Everyone knows what an embassy is, so it's quite vivid. Like, I don't think you forget it when you hear about it, and that's an important thing, because this is about the change of ideas. So we have to have ideas in common to make us think differently. And we presented it actually to a former environmental minister of Sweden, and she's now EU parliamentarian too. And she said, well, it's actually a very good idea, because when we have those negotiations, we are negotiating from state interest. Like, that's the only interest we at the table, is the interest of the states. There is no one speaking from the sea. So that's what the embassy would do. And I perceive it as a practice from the beginning. Like, it will take a decade or so, because it will be, I believe, before it will be potentially a recognized voice. But that's an important period, because this is a practice. And it could be a practice at the highest diplomatic level, but it could also be a practice around the rivers and streams leading to the Baltic Sea, because the sea doesn't begin at the shore, it begins in the mountains. And this is also, an ecological understanding that we have to have. What happens on land influences how the sea is doing. So I imagine like a lot of practices where people gather and practice speaking for the rivers, for the trees, for all the beings. There is this really exciting model of council of all beings that we practice in our ecopsychology program. And that has been developed also into interspecies council that's been used actually by the government in the UK around the river. So yeah, something like that.
So the embassy would be a group of humans who come together and say, let's represent the interests of the Baltic Sea. You have eutrophication, you have overfishing, you have the die off of a lot of these like local cultures that surround the waters, and obviously those are biocultural. There are the huge biocultural aspects to that, and these humans would represent the interests of the Baltic, speak on behalf of it, produce thought pieces. How would they then interact with other stakeholders and systems to kind of bring that voice of the sea to the places it needs to be to influence policy or agricultural practices or whatever else?
So there is so much knowledge about the Baltic Sea and about the state of the Baltic Sea and the challenges that we are dealing with. There is no shortage of information, but we don't apply that information. So what the embassy would do is to open the space to speak, as you say, on behalf of the sea and the more than human beings in the sea and the larger watershed. Because that would mean in the longer term that we actually apply what we already know, and to shift the perspective on how these decisions are made and what interests they are made in. So if when people ask me about potential ecocides in Sweden, I would say that fishing in the Baltic Sea, because it's so crazy. It's a very few individual actors fishing the herring in the sea, totally disrupting the ecosystem there, and impacting the whole sea and obviously people around the sea in this water body, which used to be our what can I say? I don't want to say our but it's just to feed us. When I was a kid, I lived close to the sea. My grandfather used to fish. If I fish today, I don't get any fish. And if I get fish, I shouldn't eat it because it's poisonous. It's so sad. Like, how could we let that happen? There was a famine, actually, in the 19th century. There was a famine in Sweden. That's when 1 million people moved to the US because there was nothing to eat. But if you look at the documentation from the archipelago, you don't see any demographics changes in the church books. For example, there was no more deaths and no less births, because people could just, when they didn't get food from agriculture, they could just fish more, and that resilience is lost. So to collectively hold the vision that we can actually support this sea that has been supporting us always to come back to life is, I think, something that we could really gather around. Uh, and from that understanding, develop different practices around, for example, agriculture.
Pella, one of the things I've been thinking about a lot lately is how we bring groups of humans together to practice the future together. I think
Yeah.
that it's a very challenging time to be alive if you allow yourself to learn and to feel and to see what's happening around socially, politically, ecologically. Things like these kinds of rights and things like having an embassy of the North Sea might, to some, seem like fanciful, speculative projects or artistic things, but actually the you mentioned interspecies councils, for example, right, which the UK has done,
Mm.
which is super cool, and you have lawyers for nature, and you have all of these kinds of groups. But I actually, like, if you ask yourself what's a version of the future I want to live in, I can't not imagine a version of the future where humans aren't coming together and practicing speaking on behalf of other beings and enmeshing the nature of which we are into our way of governing. And so, you know, if I lived close to the Baltic Sea, I would love to gather with people and be part of an embassy, even if it's an NGO, or it's not it's not a political party, and people want to think about scale and systems change, and this is systems change. It is, because I belong to a group of people learning about a place, caring for it, starting to think about how it comes back to life. And that for me is hugely important, also because it just gives belonging, it gives agency, it gives excitement, instead of sort of being paralyzed and just like, gosh, what do I do? What do I belong to? I don't know where to go.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's so much information about the state, the very sad state of the world, and we know so much about what we should not do. But unless we have somewhere to go, some direction, something to do instead, we get paralyzed. So I believe that, even if this embassy and all groups of people gathering with this intention is small in the beginning, it really starts shifting the system. And to me, that's so powerful.
I agree with you. I have a last question for you, Pella. You referenced it earlier, and you've been participating in something called eco-psychology, right? Which is a methodology, a course, a way of being. What is sort of eco-psychology, and how can people, because I like that you have this very practical kind of legal work you're doing, and then you're actually literally regenerating the land where you live with your farm, but then you're also working on this like inner realm of humans, right? So just kind of briefly, what is eco-psychology, and how does it complement your other work and practices, and maybe for people who are listening who haven't heard about it before, um, what's good for them to know about this approach?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I am a bit restless and eclectic, and I think maybe that's a sign of the how, how all encompassing I believe that this shift that we are in is. And to me, doing all of these things is just a, a way of sense making, like understanding of where are we going, where are we going to go, and how are we going to go there. And the inner work is crucial. It's absolutely so important and so much lacking in other contexts dealing with the environment. And that word, actually, the environment, is so telling from our anthropocentric culture, where we say that, well, there are humans and then there is what's around us, the environment. And that's something that we can care about if we are interested, and otherwise not. And that's just bullshit. We are always a part of a living whole, and if we don't understand that, we will not be here for very long. And that understanding of being separate from the living whole is a cultural understanding. So it's not a human thing so much as a cultural thing of Western culture, where all of the sciences have been developed, so psychology included, where psychology has been dealing with the human mind and human relationships. In the beginning, just close relationships, like to your mother, your father, your family, your lover, your kids. And then it's been developed into social psychology, dealing with society. But it's all of them, like all psychology, are saying that the psyche is something that's within a human being, most often within the head, with a very strong focus on rational thinking. Eco-psychology, that word, actually, it obviously comes from eco, the same eco as ecocide, so the home, and the psyche is the soul. So we translate it as the earth, the home, is the home of the soul. So eco-psychology is saying that the psyche isn't something you have. The psyche is more a field of relationships that you are moving within. And there are many psyches here to integrate with. And the I suppose one of the tasks of eco-psychology is for us to remember that and to come home to that understanding, and to also, in a way, to rest in that. You don't have to keep it all in your head. Like, you don't have to control the world. You can just come home to this community of life where you belong and start to relate to that. And that's a very it's a very embodied, very sensual activity. So eco-psychology is not something you're not just thinking and talking, but you're actually using the whole of who you are, your body and your senses, and your breath. And it's also saying, another task that ecopsychology is taking on is to make the diagnosis of the mental illness of humanity is because of the split. Like, there's no wonder that we are stressed and depressed, because we are denying ourselves those relationships that we were born into and that we have been living with for 99.99% of human evolution. So also when we have that split, we become destructive. So to say that a cause of the environmental destruction that we see is because of the way we perceive who we are in the world. It's a very rich, and we often call it a nomadic science. It's touching on many, many fields. So it's quite complex. And yeah, I really encourage people to learn more.
It's sort of a field of study as well. So you can go and, I mean, I've read eco-psychology books. You can become then a practitioner, right? And support other people in how they come to see that non-separation. And as you said, it's very embodied. And you mentioned the Council of All Beings, but there's eco-psychology has a philosophy and then a series of practices that you can do first to kind of understand more yourself, and then you can train to actually bring that to groups, right?
Absolutely. And I just listened to your conversation with Yun Yang, which was lovely. And he has been an important person also in that movement with the nature awareness.
I like how you call him Yun Young. It's the Swedish side because I call him John, but maybe that's my
Oh,
Swiss side. I should Yun Young sounds a lot more exotic. I love it. Um, Pella, I am so grateful that you joined us for today's episode, and really in awe of your positivity and your groundedness. You know, as much as you're working on things that are challenging, you've always struck me as just having this sort of even keel, and that's very special. So yeah, thank you so much for coming and sharing your wisdom with us today.
thank you so much for having this amazing and very important space.
Wishing you and everyone who's listening a beautiful day. Thank you so much.